Hey, I'm Eric Davison from Mudpi, and today I want to give you a crash course on how to install and get started with Mudpi for the first time. If you're interested in learning more about Mudpi, let's get started. First thing we have to do is get the SD card ready. We're going to go ahead and flash Raspberry OS to it using a common program called Etcher. You can download that online for free. Go ahead and drag and drop the image file to it and then select the SD card. Then all you have to do is hit flash. I got a warning here because my SD card's a little bit large. They're just making sure I'm not flashing my actual hard drive or something important. So go ahead and let that do its thing. It'll take a couple minutes. Once it's finished though, it's going to go ahead and automatically eject the drive. Go ahead and plug that back in because before we plug it back into the Raspberry Pi, we want to add a couple files to it. The first thing I want to set up is actually my Wi-Fi configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a Wi-Fi configuration file. This is the format here. I'll provide a link to the docs as well. I'm going to set up my SSID or the Wi-Fi name, and if you have a password, you also put your password in here. You also have the opportunity to put multiple networks. You would just copy and paste this network block if you'd like to have multiple ones. So go ahead and save this file into our SD card. It's going to be saved as wpa-supplicant.conf. On boot for the first time, the Raspberry Pi is actually going to go ahead and look for files like this, and it'll take this one and put it in the proper location for us. And the reason we're going to set up these things is so that way we can set up some settings but without the need of actually connecting a monitor and keyboard. So the second thing I'm actually going to set up here is SSH. SSH is a remote access, and I can do so by just setting up an empty file with the name SSH and no extensions, and also saving that into the root directory. So now in my folder here I have an SSH file with no extension, and we have our Wi-Fi configuration file. We're now ready to eject the drive and plug it into our Raspberry Pi for the first time. Now, if you don't have a Raspberry Pi that supports Wi-Fi, you may need a Wi-Fi adapter, but you're not going to need a mouse and keyboard. You're just going to need to plug it into power and wait a few minutes, and it'll automatically connect to our Wi-Fi for us since we set up those settings beforehand. Now we can actually access our Pi remotely through SSH using a terminal of our choice. Typing in SSH plus the user account Pi at the IP address for a Pi, you can look this up in your router, and then you can log in using the default password of Raspberry. We're now into our Raspberry Pi for the first time remotely. Once we're logged in, what I'd like to do is go ahead and enable some of the interfaces and other components that we're going to be using. You can do so using the Rasppi config tool. This is a nice little handy interface tool that they provide out of the box. Going into interfaces, I'm going to go ahead and enable SPI, I2C, the camera, any of the other things that you may plan on using. This is a little tool here to go ahead and enable those. This is also where SSH and some other things could be enabled, but we did so already through that configuration setup in the beginning. This is a handy little tool if you're not comfortable using lots of the raw commands available. And then go ahead and try to update it if it's available. Sometimes that's always good to run too, but it looks like it's already updated since we just installed the Raspberry Pi. Never hurts to check. Let's go ahead and finish off with the reboot here. And now we'll clear this out of the way, make it a little cleaner. Let's log back in with SSH again, using the Pi at the IP address. Default password of Raspberry. And now we're ready to install Mudpi. The recommended approach is to use the installer. This does a lot of heavy lifting for you. Copy and paste the command available on the documentation and also linked below. This will download and start the installer script, which is going to ask you where you want Mudpi installed, if you want to use the dashboard and the web server. There's also some stuff that's not enabled by default, like a hotspot in case you don't have Wi-Fi enabled, or if you'd like Wi-Fi to have like a fallback in case it fails. Just use the defaults if you don't have anything else that you need specifically, because they've been chosen just to get you set up out of the box. Let that go ahead and run. It's going to take several minutes. For me on a Pi 4, it took about 15 minutes or so. And on a Pi 0, those things can take about 20 minutes plus. It just depends on how fast your Pi is. Let's finish up here by restarting our Pi again and letting all the stuff that just was installed go ahead and take effect. So sudo reboot. We'll wait a couple minutes for everything to come back online, and we're going to SSH back in. But this time when we SSH in, we're going to SSH in with the Mudpi user. This was created for you during the install process. So SSH Mudpi at our IP address. The password for this is Mudpi app, all lowercase. You can find this listed in the documentation of the GitHub page for the installer. And once we're logged in, let's become a little bit more familiar with Mudpi and what kind of got installed for us and see what's all different here. The first thing you probably noticed was the Mudpi account that got created for us. A lot of the files actually get installed to this Mudpi's user home directory. So if we want to list those out using the ls command, you can go ahead and browse through here. The logs directory is where you're going to find a lot of the output messages about the Mudpi program. This is where you're going to find error messages, output messages, stuff that's normally run to the terminal if you're running it manually. Typically though, Mudpi is run in the background, and this is where you're going to find that. The core installation is installed here into the core folder. This is where the Mudpi actually copies the files from GitHub for the core during the installation process. Inside the core Mudpi folder is where we're going to install our Mudpi configuration file. Provided for you is a Mudpi config example that you can kind of use as a starting point. There's also a bunch of other examples inside the core examples folder. Let's copy this core example file and go ahead and use it as our default starting base. So I'm going to copy that over and name it mudpi.config, which is the default name for a Mudpi configuration file. Now let's run Mudpi using the Mudpi command. I'm going to specifically tell Mudpi where our configuration file is located using the configuration flag. If you want to know more about some of the options available, type in mudpi-help. I'm also setting --debug mode enabled, so that way we have additional output to the screen. Mudpi now loaded our configuration file and has successfully started. At the bottom here, we're getting updates about state changed. In the example configuration provided, you have some example components. These example components are ones that simulate real-world hardware and allow you to kind of set things up without the need of interchanging components and hardware in between each little testing phase. There are several different types of example components provided for you, like sensors, controls like switches and buttons, or even a display. In this example that we have set up here, there's 3 example sensors, which are just behind the scenes returning a random number. They're really useful for simulating and testing. The next thing we should do is check out the dashboard and see some of this data being populated on there. The dashboard will be available to us from any device that's also connected to the same network as this Pi. We can type in the Raspberry Pi's IP address in our web browser and access the dashboard. Here you'll be welcomed by a nice little greeting screen. This is later going to be updated with guides and tutorials as I have time. Let's continue through to the dashboard. Since we used the default location for our configuration file, our dashboard was able to locate our components and find their data. As I refresh the page here, you can see the example data getting updated from our components. This will reflect the data that was also getting output on our terminal. This is great. We should now talk how to run Mudpi in the background. Right now we've been running it manually so that we can see the output to our screen. Now we're going to use another program to help us do so called Supervisor. So let's go ahead and close Mudpi out using Control-C here to exit out of the program. Supervisor is a really useful tool that we can use to run our programs in the background. In the event that the program crashes or fails, it will also attempt to restart it for you. And on any boot of the device, it'll try to run the program on start if you enable it. In fact, using the installer for Mudpi, Supervisor is already installed for you. Using the Supervisor CTL status, we can see the Mudpi program here is actually detected. It's actually been stopped because when we first booted up Mudpi for the first time, there was no configuration file. Since we went ahead and set up our configuration file, let's use Supervisor now to run Mudpi for us in the background. Using the Supervisor CTL, we can start our Mudpi program. You'll see now Supervisor told us that it successfully started Mudpi, and if we want to figure out what's going on with any of the output, we should use the log files that I talked about earlier. Using the tail command, you can check out for the changes in the log file in real time. But we're not going to get any changes this time because debug mode is not enabled. The other thing to note with the Supervisor CTL is that you can also stop and restart the program. You can do so through the Supervisor CTL restart and stop commands. These are useful to know about and have in your knowledge bank, but you're probably not going to use them a lot firsthand unless you're manually doing things with Mudpi. The way Mudpi is configured in Supervisor is that it's going to automatically start for you on boot, and in the event that it fails, it'll go ahead and restart a couple times. Let's take a look at the Supervisor configuration file now too. This is useful in case you want to maybe stop Mudpi from starting or want to do it manually. It's just good to know about as well. So using an editor of your choice, you can go ahead and look in the etc supervisor conf mudpi.conf file. And also if you wanted to actually stop Supervisor entirely from using Mudpi, you can just delete this configuration file. So here you'll find auto start was set to true, which means it's going to start for us anytime the device boots up. Set that to false. There now Mudpi will not boot. This is also where you can find the error log and output log we messaged and set up. This is useful in case you want to maybe change the names of those or something. Keep in mind though that the dashboard does look for that stuff by default, so you may not want to go altering all that. Save that file, and you want to go ahead and reload the changes in Supervisor CTL if you want those to take effect. This also will happen if you restart your device. So sudo Supervisor CTL reload, everything's good, and now Mudpi will not start on boot. We have Mudpi running in the background. We also set up an example configuration file. Let's go ahead and actually open up the configuration file and do some edits to it manually. You can find the configuration file in the home, Mudpi, core, mudpi.config, and this is the Mudpi configuration file. It's quite lengthy at first, but go ahead and read through the documentation. I promise it'll get a lot more familiar, and just some of the syntax in here is a little daunting at first if you're not familiar with JSON. So you'll see our 3 example sensor components that are in there, and also up top our main Mudpi configuration. This is where we can change our location if you want metric or something. But let's just start off by just changing something simple like the debug mode. Let's set the debug mode to true. Go ahead and edit that, save it, and let's go ahead and reload our Mudpi program. Now remember, Mudpi is running in the background with Supervisor, so let's go ahead and tell Supervisor to restart our Mudpi program using the restart command. Mudpi is going to go ahead and restart. We should now get more debug log messages into our output file. Let's go ahead and check out our file now and see if we're getting those state messages again. And it looks like we are. Since I provided the -f flag, we'll see the changes to the file in real time. This is a great way if you still want to monitor Mudpi from the terminal, but want to keep it running in the background. I want to point out at this point, if you guys have any confusion or questions about what I'm doing, I've also listed a lot of this in a written form on the guides of the website. I spent a lot of time to make sure that things are pretty thorough, and also wanted to accompany the guides with some kind of video representation as well. Here you'll find examples about setting up your Raspberry Pi from scratch, interfacing with the different components available on Mudpi, or even getting started with Mudpi like we're doing now. So this is exactly where you could find some of the commands, for example, about setting up the SSH and doing some more security level things on your device. Check it out. The commands are all available there. A lot of stuff when I'm getting from and doing, I'm copy and pasting from these guides that I've written. So they're very useful. The other important aspect to note of this is the documentation. The documentation is very thorough. I've made sure to provide lots of references for different types of configuration examples, how to get started with Mudpi, every different type of component and interface available. In fact, here's the example components that we're working with now. You can get configuration examples, copy paste it, read about all the options that are available. I mean, I really wanted to make the documentation a shining part of the project, because I know even myself, I like to come back and reference it. Okay, let's do one last thing and we'll call it a day. I opened up the configuration file on a text editor on my local machine this time. We're going to go ahead and update this with a whole nother sensor, and I'm going to show you how to update that onto Mudpi, and hopefully we'll get that to reflect on the dashboard. So scrolling down here to the bottom of the sensors configuration, let's go ahead and add ourselves in another sensor. Remember, this is a JSON formatted file. If you're not familiar with it, you might want to do just a little brief reading, and there's also a ton of free tools online for formatting available. Go ahead and type in interface example, because we want an example type component here. We'll go ahead and give it a key. The key is our unique ID for this component. It shouldn't be the same as any other key, and it has to be all lowercase and no spaces. This is important to Mudpi and how it stores a lot of data behind the scenes. And then for the example component, we can provide an optional data parameter, which will set the maximum value of our random number returned. So in this case, we're going to get a random value from 0 to 100. All right. Everything looks great. Let's go ahead and save this and then get this file over to our Raspberry Pi. So since I edited this file on the local machine this time, we need to copy it over. You can do so with the SCP secure copy command. I'm just going to copy it from my local little folder here over to our Raspberry Pi. It's the same format as using SSH, except we're just going to add in a little extra colon and path to our file that we want to copy to. So go ahead and say that I want to copy over this Mudpi file to the home Mudpi core mudpi.config, and this will replace the existing file that we currently have. Go ahead and copy that over. We'll see if everything works. It's going to ask you if you want to verify this connection, since we've never done this before, and then ask you for the password. Great. Remember, the default password is Mudpi app. You can find that on the installer page. We copied our configuration file over. Let's go ahead and log back into the Pi for one last time and restart the program to detect our changes we just did. So go ahead and SSH back into our Mudpi account here. Alright, we're logged in. Let's tell Supervisor to restart our Mudpi program since it's running it for us in the background. Supervisor CTL restart Mudpi. It'll go ahead and restart and start Mudpi back up for us here. And then let's take a peek at the output log and see if everything has loaded successfully. Looks like everything is up and running good. I turned off the debug mode so it's not putting out the extra state messages here. But everything is up and running. That's wonderful. And if we go ahead here and take a peek at the dashboard now, we'll find now that we have 4 sensors here on our dashboard page. This is because we had the 3 example ones before and we just added our additional one. So that very last one there is our new My Example sensor, which we can see successfully has loaded. And as I'm refreshing the page here, I can see that my numbers come in here from 0 to 100 like we set in the configuration file. That's awesome. Well, we covered quite a bit of stuff in this video. We started from a Raspberry Pi that had nothing on it and ended up with a working Mudpi installation. I showed you how to install Mudpi using the Mudpi installer, check out the example configurations, run Mudpi in the background, and even add in a whole new component. From here you can now swap out these example components with real pieces of hardware like a temperature and humidity sensor. So that's all for now, guys. Thank you all for the continued support. God bless, and keep on growing.